The Millennium Falcon is undeniably the most famous starship of all time and a pop culture icon in its own right, but it turns out that the real life history of the ship is just as intriguing as its exploits on screen. Back in late 1974, a young George Lucas was having trouble convincing studio executives to buy into his vision of an interplanetary space opera set in a galaxy far, far away. In a bid to spark their imaginations, Lucas decided to commission a number of artists to bring his vision to life. In November of that year, he hired Colin Cantwell, who'd worked with Stanley Kubrick on developing the look of 2001: A Space Odyssey. As a model maker, painter and sci-fi superfan all in one, Cantwell was the perfect man to quite literally paint a picture of George Lucas's vision. Cantwell immediately got to work depicting the various vehicles of Star Wars' first ever draft in their earliest forms, starting with the Y-Wing before moving on to the X-Wing, Sandcrawler, and an intriguing smuggling freighter known as the Pirate Ship. Before the Millennium Falcon was eventually handed its famous name over a year later, the Corellian YT-model freighter was known simply by this name. The first time a pirate ship is mentioned in any of the scripts for Star Wars was in its second draft dated January 1975. In this draft, Lucas penned a scene in which an early version of Han Solo served on board the pirate ship along with crewmates Chewbacca, who at this point had fewer hairs than even his human shipmate, Jabba the Hutt, who was still a human, and Montrose Holdak, a character that featured in almost every version of the story without making it onto the big screen. The backstory at this point was that Han was able to steal the pirate ship away from its former captain by staging a reactor overload, hijacking the starship when everyone else on board fled. The next draft of the story saw this scene removed, making Han Solo the sole owner of the pirate ship from the very beginning. In the revised fourth draft of Star Wars dated March 1976, the Millennium Falcon was first given its iconic name, but more on that a little later. Just a few weeks after Lucas had brought Colin Cantwell on board in November of 1974, the director hired now legendary concept artist Ralph Mcquarrie to supplement his design team. This sketch is the very first drawing Mcquarrie made for Star Wars, sketched on the day he received the screenplay. The ball-like cockpit and rear engine system are intriguing in that the final Falcon design, albeit extremely different, featured both characteristics. Some of Mcquarrie's first drawings show the pirate ship alongside early Star Destroyers and TIE Fighters, in sketches clearly inspired by elements of the classic serial Flash Gordon, as well as the Discovery spaceship from 2001. Also working on designs was concept artist and effects technician Joe Johnston. Johnston's first drawings are notable as they feature a number of design elements which would endure. As Cantwell, Mcquarrie and Johnston worked on sketches and models, Lucas also began hiring storyboard artists at the beginning of 1974, starting with Alex Tavularis. The very first Star Wars storyboards depicted the opening of the film, featuring the Princess ship, which would eventually evolve into the Blockade Runner, as well as the pirate ship arriving on Alderaan, which was originally an Imperial base. The old Alderaan ended up being combined with the Death Star, but the concept of a floating city was later reused to design Cloud City from The Empire Strikes Back. The very first designs of the Falcon looked more like a standard rocket ship with a long tube-shaped fuselage leading to a frontal cockpit. With every further design, the ship moved further away from these initial concepts while still remaining long and thin in shape. Once this version of the Falcon had developed through a number of iterations, its design was completed by adding 11 large engine exhaust ports to its rear in order to make it more like the race cars which fascinated George Lucas as a child. This design, which has very little in common with the Falcon we know and love today, was actually locked as final in 1976, and ILM created a detailed blueprint of the design before sending it on to set designer Roger Christian in London, where principal photography was imminent. By chance, the British television series Space 1999 had begun airing a year earlier in 1975 and featured a ship called the Eagle Transporter, which bore a striking resemblance to the locked Falcon design. When Lucas noticed, he quickly began desperate to make the Falcon look more unique and scrapped the old design to instead be used for the Tantive 4, along with replacing its spherical cockpit with a new hammerhead design to differentiate the Rebel blockade runner even further. Nevertheless, Lucas liked the old round cockpit and kept it for the new Falcon, which was actually redesigned in less than 7 days. Lucas wanted the freighter to look as unique as possible and is often said to have taken inspiration from the shape of a half-bitten hamburger to set the vessel apart. True or not, with around the shape agreed upon, Joe Johnston designed a new circular spacecraft that was as asymmetrical as possible to echo the iconic flying saucer shape without treading on cliched ground. It's possible that Joe Johnston was inspired by the XB-982 starship from the French comic Valerian and Laureline, which bears more than a passing resemblance to the Falcon, but especially to the Ghost of Star Wars Rebels and Rogue One fame. No one is 100% on how the Millennium Falcon got its name, but the Eagle from Space 1999, as the name of another bird of prey, may well have been the inspiration behind the Falcon portion of the title. As for the Millennium part, add 1 to 1999 and you get 2000. Not wanting to call the ship the 2000 Eagle, perhaps George Lucas consulted his thesaurus and liked the sound of a Millennium Falcon even better. Ralph Mcquarrie got to work sketching the new Falcon design arriving at the Death Star, showing a highly familiar starship but with its cockpit mounted on the front, as with the original blockade runner design. Mcquarrie followed the sketches up with 4 production paintings featuring the updated design, while a Joe Johnston storyboard created around the same period featured the Falcon's famous radar dish for the very first time, although he forgot to draw the ship's cockpit due to the extremely tight schedule behind the scenes. ILM then built a model featuring this quickly developing design, nicknaming it the Pork Burger. This model was then turned into a blueprint, which was sent to London just in time for principal photography at Elstree Studios, where construction of a set of the old Falcon design had already begun before being called off. The final creative aspect that was needed to bring the Millennium Falcon to life was its iconic sounds. Sound designer Ben Burtt gave the Falcon's base engines the noise of a piston-driven P-51 fighter plane in slow motion. He recorded part of the sound at an air show in Wisconsin, and as a gesture of thanks, Lucasfilm later donated a model of the Falcon to the Experimental Aircraft Association's Air Museum. The sound of the ship jumping through hyperspace comes from 2 tracks of the engine noise of a McDonnell Douglas DC-9 jet, with one track slightly out of synchronization with the other to produce a futuristic phasing effect. Ben Burtt then added the hum of cooling fans on the motion control rig at ILM to finish the sound. The Falcon's iconic hyperdrive malfunction noise was made using a misfiring engine from a 1929 Waco biplane, the hiss of a dentist's air jet, and groaning water pipes from the San Anselmo studio where Burtt worked.
Alright, now if we took all these sounds and played them together, we get the following effect of the hyperdrive malfunctioning.
When filming began on Star Wars in March 1976, a 5-foot model of the Falcon was built by ILM for use on camera using the kit bashing technique, meaning spare parts from real objects and modelling kits were used to create something new. The Falcon model was made using parts from Ferrari and Tiger Tank model sets and was mounted on a blue pole to allow ILM to implement special effects. It was then filmed with motion control cameras running around the model on rails to give the effect of a real kinetic vehicle. The model was actually built before Joe Johnston had a chance to sketch the new Falcon, which is why there are no original sketched concepts of the final Millennium Falcon itself. In terms of the ship sets, the biggest constructed for A New Hope was the Falcon's exterior. To cut costs, only half of the plywood and steel exterior was built in the boarding ramp and cockpit portions. visible during the iconic scene at Mos Eisley Spaceport's Docking Bay 94, which was one of the very first scenes shot at Elstree. When Luke mocks the ship by calling it a piece of junk, it briefly becomes obvious that the half of the ship with the radar dish is missing. This was entirely due to budgetary constraints, given that work on the original Falcon design had already begun at Elstree Studios, only to be torn down to make way for the new design. The only other scene in which the life-size Falcon was used was for the Death Star hangar scenes. Because the Falcon exterior was too big and too fragile to move, set designers Norman Reynolds and John Barry replaced the set surrounding the ship instead, meaning the hangar and Docking Bay 94 were actually shot in the exact same location. Most of the Death Star hangar set was real, except for a brief glimpse of a matte painting when our heroes glanced down at the Falcon from above. Smaller Millennium Falcon sets built for A New Hope included the cockpit, the hallway with the boarding ramp, the main hold with the hollow chest table and the gun turret, which was actually a single space filmed in a manner which gave the impression that Han and Luke were shooting from separate locations. Just prior to the cockpit set's construction, Lucas took inspiration from the interior of a World War II B-29 bomber to create the Falcon's iconic greenhouse-style frontal window. On a side note, a little known fact about the Millennium Falcon is that due to the incredible speed at which its final appearance was designed, the ship's interior dimensions and exterior dimensions do not actually match up whatsoever. Unlike the TARDIS in Doctor Who, this was a complete accident. If the Falcon's insides were actually sized the same way they appear on screen, then the ship would have to be far taller in height than the extremely thin design shown in the saga. For The Empire Strikes Back, a portion of the Falcon's core design was modified to counter balancing issues. The design from A New Hope had 3 landing gears, 2 to the rear and 1 at the front, but this asymmetrical configuration caused the ship to become unstable. So for Empire, the belly of the ship gained 2 extra landing gears to bring the total to a more balanced 5, as well as 2 new headlights on the end of the ship's mandibles. The Falcon's exterior was rebuilt, but this time in full, to make the Hoth hangar scenes in which Han and Chewie repair the ship possible. Just like for A New Hope, rather than moving the Falcon, the sets surrounding the ship were moved instead, for scenes such as the X-Gorth cave slug's belly and the Cloud City landing platform. Also for Empire, Lucas decided to up the stakes and push what the Falcon's model sets could handle. In A New Hope, the Falcon's movement through space appeared more rigid due to the huge 5-foot size of its extremely heavy model, but for Empire's complicated asteroid chase scene, using the same model would not be possible for all the necessary swivels and flips. This required a fresh Falcon model to be built, and at 2.5 feet, the new version was half the size of its predecessor. A little known fact about the Millennium Falcon's acrobatic scene in the asteroid field is that many of the more distant space rocks were actually potatoes, added after visual effects supervisor Ken Ralston joked that many of the larger asteroids resembled them. The Empire Strikes Back also saw the creation of a palm-sized Falcon to be used for the scene where the ship lands on the Star Destroyer, as well as a detailed model of its roof for Luke's rescue by Lando. The filming of Return of the Jedi saw no new Millennium Falcon models made for the film, as many of the models used in Empire were deemed useful enough to repurpose. As for the sets, the production crew unpacked the full-size Falcon from Empire for the first days of shooting on January 11, 1982, when the sandstorm scene on Tatooine between Luke, Leia, Han and Chewie was filmed. Though the scene was cut and almost forgotten, it was later resurrected in all its grainy, noisy glory for the complete saga's official Blu-ray release in 2011. Every other scene involving the Falcon's exterior in Episode 6 was actually achieved using matte paintings. The smaller sets that were rebuilt for Empire, such as the cockpit, gun turret, main hold and hallways, were also repurposed for Jedi. For new scenes showing the Falcon flying through Bespin in the 1997 special editions, a CGI model was created by ILM. Another digital version of the ship was featured in Revenge of the Sith in 2005, during a brief cameo in which a slightly bluer Millennium Falcon flies towards the Senate building on Coruscant. George Lucas later confirmed that the ship was indeed the Falcon and not just another YT-model freighter of the same shape and size. The CGI version of the ship also appears in the Disney attraction Star Tours The Adventures Continue. Back in June 2014, TMZ confirmed that the Millennium Falcon will return for the 7th installment in the franchise, The Force Awakens, when the publication leaked a set photo showing a full-size Falcon being rebuilt. For the film, the ship's exterior and interior were rebuilt in their entirety at Pinewood Studios near London, and as with all the previous Falcon sets, they were built separately in different locations. Millennium Falcon sets produced for The Force Awakens included the full-sized exterior set, a full-size multi-room interior set, and at least 2 cockpit sets designed for shooting at multiple angles. A CGI recreation of the Falcon was also made for the scenes on Jakku and Starkiller Base, based on the original 5-foot model from A New Hope, with additional detailing added to reflect the passage of time. The most notable change added to the Falcon for the sequel trilogy is its new rectangular dish, replacing the circular dish from the original trilogy, infamously lost in the second Death Star's decimation. In The Force Awakens Incredible Cross-Sections book, author Jason Fry intended to include an image of the freighter carrying a cargo load between its 2 frontal mandibles, but he was unable to get a picture made in time. Nevertheless, there is considerable speculation that a scene in the upcoming Han Solo Origins movie, Solo, will feature the Falcon performing its original duty as a freighter, hauling cargo between its mandibles. An image from Solo was apparently leaked recently showing the Falcon set, while Making Star Wars revealed that the starship will bear its bluish paint scheme from Revenge of the Sith in the new film. Solo is likely to give us our first look at a number of legendary Star Wars involving the Millennium Falcon, including Han and Chewie's first meeting, Han winning the ship from Lando, the infamous spice mines of Kessel and the Kessel Run itself. With the Millennium Falcon also set to return for Star Wars Episode 8 The Last Jedi, it's fair to say there's still plenty more to come from the most iconic starship in cinema history.